June 13th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Villers-Bocage, Normandy, France. Private Herbert Thompson pressed his back against the cold stone wall of a Norman farmhouse, his fingers trembling as they gripped the tubular steel weapon that weighed 32 pounds but felt like 100. The projector, infantry, anti-tank, everyone just called it the PIAT, sat heavy across his knees. Through the morning mist rolling across the hedgerows, he could hear them coming. The distinctive clanking rumble of German tank tracks on cobblestones echoed through the narrow streets of Villers-Bocage. Thompson glanced at his loader, Lance Corporal Dennis Williams, a former coal miner from Yorkshire whose hands were steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Williams clutched 3 PIAT bombs against his chest like they were his children. What neither man knew, what none of the handful of British soldiers scattered through this sleepy Norman market town could have imagined, was that in the next 4 hours, they would face the most feared tank commander in the German army. They would be outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned. The Germans expected them to run. They expected British soldiers to do what any sane infantry would do when faced with Tiger tanks: retreat, regroup, and call for their own armor. Instead, Thompson and Williams would discover what desperation, a spring-loaded tube, and British stubbornness could accomplish. They would learn that sometimes the most primitive weapon in the hands of men who refused to quit could destroy the most advanced killing machines ever built. The battle that unfolded that morning would become legend in the British Army. It would prove that courage and determination could overcome technological superiority. And it would demonstrate something the Germans had consistently underestimated, that British infantry, when pushed into a corner, didn't break. They fought. To understand what happened at Villers-Bocage, you first need to understand the PIAT. Military historians have called it one of the worst anti-tank weapons of World War II. British soldiers had less charitable descriptions. They called it the pig, the stovepipe, and several names that can't be repeated in polite company. The PIAT was born from British desperation. After Dunkirk in 1940, the British Army had abandoned nearly all its heavy weapons on French beaches. The nation faced potential German invasion with virtually no anti-tank capability. The boys' anti-tank rifle, Britain's standard anti-tank weapon, was already obsolete. Its .303-inch bullets couldn't penetrate modern German armor. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, a somewhat eccentric British officer, designed the PIAT in 1941. Unlike German or American anti-tank weapons that used rockets or recoilless rifles, the PIAT worked on an absurdly simple principle. It was essentially a giant spring-loaded spigot mortar that threw a 3-pound bomb at the enemy. Here's how it worked. A massive spring inside the tube provided the launching force. The soldier cocked this spring by lying on the ground, bracing the weapon against his shoulder, and pushing down on the cocking mechanism with every ounce of strength he possessed. This required about 200 pounds of force. Once cocked, pulling the trigger released the spring, which drove a steel rod forward. This rod, called the spigot, entered a hollow tube on the back of the bomb and launched it toward the target. The bomb itself was actually quite clever. It had a shaped charge warhead that could penetrate 4 inches of armor. On impact, the charge created a jet of superheated metal that could burn through tank armor and kill everyone inside. In theory, the PIAT could destroy any German tank, even the mighty Tiger. In practice, the weapon was a nightmare to use. First, you had to get close, terrifyingly close. The PIAT's effective range was about 100 yards. That meant you needed to let a 30-ton tank get within the length of a football field before you fired. At that range, you could see the faces of the German crew. They could certainly see you. Second, the weapon was incredibly awkward. It weighed 32 pounds empty. With a loaded bomb, it topped 35 pounds. It was 3 feet 9 inches long, making it unwieldy in close combat. Soldiers described carrying it as like lugging around a full-grown sheep that fought back. Third, and most importantly, the weapon was dangerous to its operator. The cocking mechanism was so heavy that men sometimes injured themselves preparing to fire. The backblast, while less severe than a bazooka, could still burn anyone standing too close behind. And if you held it wrong, the recoil could break your shoulder or collarbone. Sergeant Thomas Pritchard of the 2nd Battalion, Essex Regiment, wrote in his diary in April 1944, "Trained with the PIAT today. 3 men injured during cocking. Jenkins broke his wrist. The weapon inspector said it was working perfectly. If this is our anti-tank defense, God help us. British soldiers vastly preferred captured German Panzerfausts or American bazookas. Given a choice, most infantry would rather face tanks with grenades and Molotov cocktails than trust the PIAT. The weapon had one of the highest malfunction rates in the British arsenal. Yet the PIAT had advantages that weren't immediately obvious. Unlike rocket launchers, it had no backblast signature. A bazooka or Panzerschreck produced a massive flame and smoke cloud when fired, instantly revealing the shooter's position. The PIAT just made a dull thud. In close urban combat, this invisibility was invaluable. Second, the PIAT's bomb had a larger explosive charge than comparable weapons. While harder to aim and less accurate, when it hit hard. The 3-pound warhead could devastate not just tanks, but bunkers, buildings, and infantry positions. Third, the weapon was simple. It had no complex firing mechanism, no electric circuits, no rockets that could fail. It was a spring, a rod, and a trigger. It would work when wet, when dirty, when frozen. British soldiers fighting in Burma found that PIATs still functioned after being submerged in monsoon floods. Bazookas and Panzerschrecks would have been useless. By June 1944, British infantry had developed grudging respect for the PIAT. Not love, never love, but respect. They'd learned that in the right hands, in the right circumstances, the ugly spring-loaded tube could kill tigers. Private Herbert Thompson had fired the PIAT exactly 6 times in training. He'd never hit a moving target. He'd never faced a real tank. When his platoon commander assigned him as PIAT gunner, he'd considered it punishment duty. Nobody wanted to carry 35 pounds of barely functional anti-tank weapon. Now crouched in a Norman farmhouse with German tanks approaching, Thompson wished he'd paid more attention during training. He wished he'd practiced more. Mostly, he wished he was anywhere else. The British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats who'd fought Rommel across North Africa, had landed in Normandy a week after D-Day. Their mission was to exploit the successful beachhead and push inland. By June 13th, they'd advanced further than any other Allied unit, penetrating deep into Norman countryside toward the strategically vital town of Caen. The advance had been extraordinary. British tanks rolled through German positions that had barely recovered from the initial invasion shock. Resistance was scattered and confused. By the evening of June 12th, the leading elements of the 7th Armored Division reached the outskirts of Villers-Bocage, a market town astride a crucial crossroads. Brigadier William Looney Hind, commanding the 22nd Armored Brigade, saw an opportunity. If his forces could seize Villers-Bocage and push beyond to Point 213, a commanding hill east of town, they could threaten the entire German defensive line. They might even cut off German forces defending Caen. Early on June 13th, a company of the 1st Battalion, Rifle Brigade, along with a squadron of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, pushed into Villers-Bocage. They found the town virtually undefended. French civilians emerged to greet them with flowers and wine. The British soldiers thought they'd achieved a bloodless victory. They were catastrophically wrong. What British intelligence hadn't discovered was that the 501st Heavy SS Panzer Battalion had moved into positions just east of Villers-Bocage during the night. This unit was equipped with Tiger tanks, the most feared armored vehicles in the German arsenal, and commanding the 2nd Company was SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, the most successful tank commander in history. Wittmann had destroyed 117 Allied tanks on the Eastern Front. He'd won the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. German propaganda celebrated him as an invincible panzer ace. His Tiger tank, number 207, was a legend among German troops. At 7 o'clock that morning, Wittmann was positioned in woods overlooking the main road through Villers-Bocage. Through his commander's cupola, he watched in disbelief as British tanks and vehicles rolled into town in a loose column, completely unaware of his presence. They're driving like they're on parade, he told his gunner, SS Unterscharführer Balthasar Voll. No reconnaissance, no security. They think they've already won. Wittmann made a decision that would define the battle. Rather than wait for support, rather than call in the rest of his company, he would attack immediately with just his single Tiger. Against 25 British tanks and dozens of vehicles, one Tiger would strike. German commanders expected British armor to be competent but cautious. They expected proper reconnaissance and combined arms tactics. They certainly didn't expect the British to advance blindly into perfect ambush positions. What Wittmann didn't expect was what would happen when his Tiger entered Villers-Bocage itself. At 7:15, Wittmann's Tiger emerged from the tree line and began systematically destroying the British column. His first shot knocked out a Cromwell tank at 900 yards. Before the British could react, he'd destroyed 3 more tanks and 2 half-tracks. The British column, strung out along a narrow road with high hedgerows on both sides, was trapped. Tanks couldn't turn around. They couldn't deploy off the road. They could only push forward or reverse backward. And reversing meant exposing their thin rear armor. Wittmann drove down the column like a farmer harvesting wheat. His gunner, Voll, was one of the best in the German army. Each shot was aimed with precision. Each shot penetrated. Within 5 minutes, Wittmann had destroyed 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 15 transport vehicles. The survivors scattered. Some crews bailed out and fled into the fields. Others tried desperately to return fire, but the Tiger's thick frontal armor shrugged off their shells. The Cromwell's 75mm gun simply couldn't penetrate the Tiger at combat ranges. British tankers who'd fought in the desert, who'd faced German Panzers at El Alamein and Mareth, had never experienced anything like this. Sergeant Stan Lockwood, commanding a Cromwell in A Squadron, radioed back, "Tiger in town. He's everywhere. We can't stop him. We can't even hurt him." Wittmann pushed deeper into Villers-Bocage. His Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy any British vehicle with a single shot. He drove down the main street, his commander's hatch open, directing fire at targets that appeared in windows and doorways. The French civilians who'd been celebrating liberation minutes earlier now hid in cellars as the Tiger's gun shook buildings and filled the streets with smoke and cordite. The battle had transformed from triumphant advance to desperate survival in less than 10 minutes. By 7:30, Wittmann had destroyed or disabled 25 British vehicles. He'd cut the British column in half and isolated the forward elements in the town center. German reports later claimed he'd single-handedly destroyed an entire British armored regiment. This was an exaggeration. A squadron had other tanks outside his engagement zone, but the psychological impact was devastating. British soldiers who'd thought they were advancing against beaten Germans now faced a tactical genius in an unstoppable machine. And then Wittmann's Tiger turned down Rue Georges Clemenceau, a narrow street lined with Norman stone buildings. He was hunting for more British armor. He didn't see Private Thompson and Lance Corporal Williams crouched in a second-floor window of a draper's shop. Thompson had heard the battle erupt before he saw the Tiger. The distinctive boom of an 88mm gun was unmistakable. Then came the screaming of wounded men, the crackle of ammunition cooking off in destroyed tanks, and the terrified shouts of British soldiers trying to organize a defense. His section commander, Sergeant Arthur Brough, had ordered Thompson and Williams into the draper's shop with their PIAT. "If a Jerry tank comes down this street, you stop it," Brough said. "I don't care how. You bloody well stop it." Then Brough disappeared to organize the other men. Thompson and Williams were alone with their PIAT and 3 bombs. Williams, the coal miner from Yorkshire, was surprisingly calm. "Right then, Herbert," he said, using Thompson's first name despite regulations. "Reckon we're about to earn our pay." Thompson tried to remember his training. The instructor back in England had emphasized patience. "Let the tank get close," the man had said. "Closer than you think you can stand. Aim for the tracks or the engine deck. And, for God's sake, don't miss." Through the window, Thompson could see the Main Street intersection. A Cromwell tank burned there, black smoke pouring from its hatches. Bodies lay in the street. The town that had been celebrating liberation was now a killing ground. Then he saw it. The Tiger emerged around the corner like a prehistoric monster. It was enormous, far larger than Thompson had imagined. The tank weighed 54 tons, heavier than 10 loaded trucks. Its tracks were 30 inches wide. The 88mm gun protruded like an accusing finger. Thompson's hands started shaking so badly he could barely hold the PIAT. The Tiger's armor was over 4 inches thick on the front. Nothing the British had could penetrate it from the front. The PIAT's shaped charge could penetrate 4 inches of armor, but only if it hit perfectly perpendicular to the surface. "Side shot," Williams whispered. "Wait for the side." The Tiger rumbled past their position, its commander visible in the open cupola, scanning for targets. Thompson could see the man's face, see the iron cross at his throat. The tank was perhaps 30 feet away, close enough to hit with a thrown rock. Williams loaded the PIAT, sliding the 3-pound bomb onto the spigot with practiced ease despite his trembling hands. Thompson pressed his shoulder against the weapon's butt plate and aimed at the Tiger's side armor just below the turret. The PIAT's crude sights were almost useless at this range, but he didn't need them. The target filled his entire view. Now, Williams breathed. Thompson pulled the trigger. The PIAT made its characteristic hollow thunk sound. The spring released. The spigot drove the bomb forward. Thompson felt the brutal recoil slam into his shoulder, but he kept his eyes on the target. The bomb flew across the 30 feet of space in less than a second. It struck the Tiger's side armor at a slight angle, right at the junction between hull and turret. The shaped charge detonated with a sharp crack. For a moment, nothing happened. Thompson thought he'd failed, thought the bomb had bounced off or failed to penetrate. Then smoke began pouring from the Tiger's engine deck. The tank lurched to a stop. The commander dropped inside the turret and slammed the hatch shut. "You hit him!" Williams shouted. "You actually bloody hit him!" But the Tiger wasn't dead. Its turret began traversing toward their position. Thompson realized with horror that while he'd damaged the tank, possibly disabled it, he hadn't killed it. And now they were about to face the wrath of an 88mm gun at point-blank range. Williams was already cocking the PIAT for a second shot, his face red with effort as he forced the spring down. "Load faster," Thompson hissed, knowing it was impossible. The cocking mechanism needed time. The Tiger's gun was almost on them when British artillery suddenly screamed overhead. Someone had called in fire support. High explosive shells bracketed the street, throwing up geysers of stone and earth. The Tiger couldn't fire through the curtain of explosions. Williams finished cocking the PIAT. Thompson took aim again, his shoulder throbbing from the first shot's recoil. The Tiger was backing up now, trying to escape the artillery, presenting its thinner rear armor. Thompson fired again. The second bomb hit the Tiger's engine deck dead center. This time, the result was immediate and catastrophic. Flames erupted from the engine compartment. The Tiger's hatches popped open and crew members bailed out, their uniforms smoking. British infantry who'd been hiding in buildings now opened fire with rifles and Sten guns. The German tankers, disoriented and wounded, were cut down before they could take cover. Wittmann, because it was indeed Wittmann in that Tiger, managed to escape into a side street with 2 of his crew. Thompson sat back against the wall, his shoulder screaming in pain, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Williams looked at him and started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound. "We just killed a Tiger," the Yorkshireman said. "With a bloody PIAT. Nobody's going to believe this." But the battle was far from over. Wittmann's Tiger had been the first to enter Villers-Bocage. It wouldn't be the last. Word of the Tiger's destruction spread rapidly through the British positions. Soldiers who'd been preparing to evacuate suddenly found new resolve. If a PIAT team could stop a Tiger, then maybe they could hold the town. Sergeant Bry found Thompson and Williams in the draper's shop, both men still shaking from adrenaline. "Don't get comfortable," Bro said. "Jerry's bringing up more tanks. We're forming a proper defense." British officers were organizing blocking positions throughout Villers-Bocage. The initial shock of Wittmann's rampage had worn off. Now came the hard work of preparing to defend against inevitable German counterattacks. The rifle brigade companies scattered through the town had roughly 300 men. Infantry armed with rifles, Sten guns, a few Bren light machine guns, and PIATs. They also had several 6-pounder anti-tank guns that crews had managed to manhandle into position. Against them, German forces were massing. The rest of Wittmann's company was moving up. 4 more Tigers and several Panzer TVs. German infantry from the 2nd Panzer Division was also approaching. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were preparing a coordinated attack to retake the town. The odds were horrific. British armor had been decimated. The survivors of A Squadron had pulled back beyond the town. Artillery support was available but limited. The nearest British reserves were miles away. Villers-Bocage's defenders would face German panzers with essentially just small arms and P8s. Major Dennis Wright, commanding the rifle company holding the town center, gathered his men. "We're not pulling back," he announced. "We took this town, and we're keeping it until relieved. Every PIAT team, every anti-tank gun, gets into the best position you can find. Wait for close shots. Make every round count." Thompson and Williams were assigned a new position in a hotel overlooking the main square. From the third-floor window, they could see down 3 different streets. Bruff gave them 2 more PIAT bombs, bringing their total ammunition to 3. "Make them count," he said. "We're running low on everything." The waiting was almost worse than the fighting. Thompson could hear German tank engines in the distance, could hear orders being shouted in German. The civilians had all taken shelter. The town felt like a ghost town, empty except for British soldiers crouched in windows and doorways. At 11 o'clock, the German attack began. 4 Tigers and 5 Panzer Rafales rolled into Villers-Bocage from 3 different directions. The German commanders had learned from Wittmann's fate. They weren't charging blindly. They advanced carefully, with infantry support, suppressing suspected British positions with machine gun fire before exposing themselves. The German plan was simple but effective. The Tigers would provide covering fire while Panzer IIIs moved forward. German grenadiers would clear buildings. Once the British anti-tank weapons were suppressed or destroyed, the Tigers would push through and crush any remaining resistance. On paper, it should have worked. The Tigers were nearly invulnerable to British weapons. The Panzer Acers, while more vulnerable, still outmatched anything the infantry carried. German firepower was overwhelming, but the Germans hadn't counted on British determination or the peculiar advantages of PIAT teams fighting in urban terrain. The 1st Tiger advancing down Rue Pasteur ran into Sergeant Bill Close's PIAT team. Close, a former butcher from Manchester, had positioned himself in a butcher's shop. He appreciated the irony, with a perfect view down the street. When the Tiger reached a point 40 yards away, Close fired. His bomb struck the Tiger's track, blowing off several track links and immobilizing the 54-ton monster. The Tiger couldn't move forward or backward. Its turret traversed, searching for the shooter, but Close and his loader had already dropped to the ground floor and were escaping through a back door. The immobilized Tiger blocked the entire street. The following Panzer IVs couldn't get around it. The German advance on that axis had been stopped cold by a single PIAT bomb. On the main square, Thompson watched 2 Panzer IVs approach cautiously. These were older tanks, not as heavily armored as Tigers, but still deadly. Their 75mm guns could demolish buildings with high explosive rounds. Williams loaded the PIAT silently. Both men had developed an almost telepathic coordination. Thompson tracked the lead Panzer IV through his crude sights, waiting for the perfect moment. The German tank commander was being smart. He'd stop, scan, then advance in short bounds, never exposing himself for long. But urban fighting has peculiar rhythms, and Thompson had begun to understand them. He noticed the pattern. Stop, scan for 5 seconds, advance for 3, stop again. When the Panzer IV made its next advance, Thompson fired. The bomb hit the tank's turret face, the weakest point on a Panzer IV from the front. The shaped charge burned through the thin armor. The tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from every hatch. The 2nd Panzer IV immediately reversed, its commander unwilling to push forward over his burning comrade. 2 German tankers bailed out of the destroyed tank, uniforms aflame. British riflemen in adjacent buildings cut them down with precisely aimed shots. All across Villers-Bocage, similar scenes played out. PIAT teams hidden in buildings, cellars, and ruins waited for German armor to expose itself, then struck. The British 6-pounder anti-tank guns joined the fight, their 2-pound shells capable of penetrating Panzer IV side armor at close range. The German attack, which should have overwhelmed the British defenders in minutes, stalled. 3 Tigers were still operational and deadly, but they couldn't advance without infantry support. And British machine guns and riflemen made German infantry advances suicidal. By noon, 5 German tanks burned in Villers-Bocage's streets. The Germans had lost perhaps 50 infantry killed or wounded. The British had lost 30 men, most from tank rounds that demolished their hiding positions. But the British were running out of PIAT ammunition. Thompson had 1 bomb left. Most other teams were in similar situations. The 6-pounder guns had perhaps 20 rounds between them. If the Germans attacked again with any determination, the defenders couldn't stop them. At 1 o'clock, Major Wright received new orders from brigade headquarters. They were to evacuate Villers-Bocage. The 7th Armored Division was consolidating positions several miles to the rear. The salient into Villers-Bocage had become untenable. Holding the town wasn't worth the casualties it would cost. Wright was furious but professional. Orders were orders. He began organizing an orderly withdrawal, scheduling it for 2 o'clock. Vehicles would evacuate first, carrying wounded. Infantry would follow in stages, with rear guards covering each phase. Thompson learned of the withdrawal with mixed feelings. Part of him desperately wanted to leave, to escape this death trap, where every street corner might hide a tiger, but another part felt betrayed. They'd held the town. They'd stopped German tanks with primitive weapons and courage. Now they were giving it all back. "Don't think about it," Williams advised. "We did our job. Now we get out alive. That's victory enough." The evacuation began smoothly. Wounded men were loaded onto trucks and half-tracks. These vehicles raced out of town, German artillery pursuing them but causing little damage. Then the infantry began withdrawing, section by section. Thompson's section was designated as part of the final rearguard. They would hold positions until everyone else had cleared, then make their own escape. It was the most dangerous assignment, but someone had to do it. At 2:30, German forces discovered the British were withdrawing. Immediately, they pressed their attack. The 3 remaining Tigers surged forward, supported by infantry who'd been reinforced with a company from the 2nd Panzer Division. The British rearguard faced 2 options: stand and die, buying time for the withdrawal, or run and risk the entire evacuation dissolving into chaos. Men like Sergeant Brew, Major Wright, and yes, Private Thompson and Lance Corporal Williams chose to stand. Thompson's position in the hotel had become isolated. Most of the surrounding buildings had been evacuated. German infantry were filtering through the town, clearing rooms and cellars. The Tiger tanks were methodically demolishing British strongpoints with high explosive rounds. Williams looked at Thompson with grim humor. "Well, Herbert," he said, "reckon we're properly buggered." Thompson hefted the PIAT, feeling its familiar, awkward weight. They had 1 bomb left. One chance to do something useful before they ran or died. Through the window, he could see a Tiger advancing up the main street. It was moving confidently now, its commander aware the British were withdrawing. The tank's machine guns raked buildings systematically, suppressing any possible ambush positions. "We should go," Williams said quietly. "Everyone else has pulled out. We've done enough." Thompson knew he was right. They'd done more than enough. They'd killed 1 Tiger, damaged another, destroyed a Panzer IV. They'd held their position for hours against impossible odds. No one could ask for more, but something in Thompson rebelled against running. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of burning British tanks and dead friends in the streets. Maybe it was just stupidity. "Load the gun," Thompson said. Williams stared at him for a moment, then grinned. "You're bloody mad, you know that?" "Yeah, I know." Williams loaded the last PIAT bomb while Thompson calculated angles and distances. The Tiger was advancing slowly, perhaps 50 yards away. Too far for a good shot with the PIAT's crude sights, but not impossible. The trick, Thompson realized, wasn't to hit the frontal armor. That was too thick. He needed a side shot, like the first time. But the Tiger was advancing straight down the street, presenting only its front. "We need it to turn," Thompson muttered. "How do we make a 54-ton tank turn?" Williams asked. Thompson had an idea, a stupid, probably suicidal idea. "I'm going out there." "What?" "I'm going to stand in the street, make him turn the turret to shoot me. When he does, you'll have a side shot at the turret." Williams grabbed his arm. "That's mental. He'll kill you." "Maybe," Thompson admitted, "but if I move fast enough, maybe not. And you'll have your shot." Before Williams could argue further, Thompson was moving. He clattered down the hotel stairs, burst through the front door, and ran into the middle of the street. The Tiger was 60 yards away. Thompson stood there, waving his arms like a madman. "Oi!" he shouted at the Tiger. "You big German bastard!" The Tiger's turret began traversing toward him. The 88mm gun tracked across the street, aiming at this insane British soldier who decided to challenge a tank with nothing but profanity. Thompson waited until he could see down the barrel of the gun, until he was absolutely certain the German gunner had him in the sights. Then he dove sideways, rolling behind a low stone wall just as the Tiger fired. The high explosive shell hit where Thompson had been standing a split second before. The blast picked him up and threw him like a rag doll. His ears rang. His lungs felt like they'd collapsed, but he was alive, and the Tiger's side armor was exposed. Williams, watching from the hotel window, didn't hesitate. The moment the Tiger's turret traversed away from him, he aimed the PIAT at the exposed turret ring, the junction between turret and hull, the weakest point on any tank. He fired. The PIAT's last bomb flew true. It struck the turret ring perfectly, the shaped charge burning through the thin armor into the fighting compartment. The Tiger shuddered. Smoke poured from the commander's cupola. The hatches remained closed. The crew was dead inside, killed by the superheated jet of metal that had incinerated the interior. Williams dropped the PIAT and ran down to grab Thompson, who was struggling to his feet, dazed and bleeding from a dozen cuts but alive. Together, they stumbled through back gardens and over walls, following the withdrawal route while German infantry closed in behind them. They reached British lines an hour later, exhausted and filthy. Thompson's shoulder was dislocated from the PIAT's recoil and from being thrown by the shell blast. Williams had a piece of shrapnel in his leg he hadn't noticed until they were safe. A medical orderly looked at them with awe. "You two are the PIAT team that held the hotel?" he asked. "We heard the reports. 3 Tigers destroyed." "2 Tigers," Thompson corrected through gritted teeth as a medic manipulated his shoulder back into socket. "And a Panzer IV. Get it right." The Battle of Villers-Bocage was officially a British defeat. The 7th Armored Division withdrew. The Germans reoccupied the town. The flanking maneuver that might have broken German defenses failed. British casualties included 20 armored vehicles destroyed and 76 men killed or wounded, but the Germans had paid an extraordinary price. They'd lost at least 6 tanks destroyed, including 2 Tigers. They'd suffered over 100 casualties, and they'd learned that British infantry armed with PIATs could kill even their most powerful tanks. More importantly, the psychological impact resonated through both armies. British soldiers discovered they could stop Tigers, not with superior weapons or technology, but with courage and the most primitive anti-tank weapon in their arsenal. German tankers learned they weren't invulnerable, that even Tigers could die to a determined infantryman with a spring-loaded tube. Michael Whitman survived the battle. His Tiger was destroyed, but he escaped with minor wounds. He would die 2 months later when Canadian Shermans ambushed his Tiger near Caen. The invincible Panzer Ace's myth had been punctured at Villers-Bocage when a British private with a PIAT proved that even legends could bleed. The engagement spawned a legend in the British Army. PIAT teams who'd been dreaded assignments became badges of honor. The weapon that nobody wanted became the weapon that stopped Tigers. Training standards increased dramatically. Soldiers who'd tried to avoid PIAT duty now volunteered. For it, Private Herbert Thompson was awarded the Military Medal for his actions at Villers-Bocage. The citation specifically noted his destruction of 2 enemy tanks and his extraordinary courage in exposing himself to enemy fire to create an opportunity for his comrade. He received the medal from Montgomery himself. Lance Corporal Dennis Williams received the military medal as well. His citation praised his cool effectiveness under fire and expert service of his weapon during sustained combat against superior enemy forces. Sergeant Arthur Brow, who'd organized the defense and coordinated the PIAT teams throughout the battle, received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Major Dennis Wright received the Distinguished Service Order, but the real legacy wasn't the medals. It was what the battle proved. After Villers-Bocage, attitudes toward the PIAT transformed. The weapon remained awkward, heavy, and difficult to use, but now soldiers knew what it could do in the right circumstances. British infantry throughout northwest Europe adopted new tactics based on lessons from Villers-Bocage. PIAT teams learned to work in pairs, supporting each other. They practiced urban combat techniques, perfecting ambush positions and escape routes. They studied German tank vulnerabilities, learning exactly where to aim for maximum effect. The numbers tell the story. Between D-Day and VE Day, British PIAT teams are credited with destroying over 350 German tanks and assault guns. That's more than some entire armored divisions destroyed. The weapon proved especially valuable in Italy, where mountainous terrain and narrow roads created perfect ambush conditions. In the Gothic line fighting, PIAT teams repeatedly stopped German counterattacks that might have broken British positions. Even in the Far East, where British forces had fewer tanks to face, the PIAT proved its worth. Against Japanese bunkers and fortifications, the 3-pound bomb was devastatingly effective. British infantry attacking Japanese positions in Burma found the PIAT could demolish strongpoints that artillery had failed to suppress. The German army took notice. Post-battle reports from Villers Bocage and subsequent engagements emphasized the danger of British anti-tank teams. German tank commanders received specific instructions about urban combat, warning them about the threat from short-range infantry weapons. German intelligence assessed the PIAT as primitive but effective in skilled hands. One captured German tank officer, interviewed after the war, described his fear of PIATs. The Panzer and bazooka we respected. We could see them fire and take evasive action. The PIAT was silent. You didn't know it was there until your tank was burning. That made it terrifying. The Battle of Villers Bocage taught lessons that extended far beyond one Norman town. For the British, it reinforced the importance of determination in the face of superior enemy equipment. British infantry learned they could defeat German armor through courage, initiative, and proper use of available weapons. The tactical lessons were equally important. British commanders learned that urban terrain could negate German armored superiority. Buildings provided cover for anti-tank teams. Narrow streets channeled tanks into kill zones. Rubble and walls blocked fields of fire. After Villers Bocage, British forces increasingly used urban defensive positions when facing German armored counterattacks. They fortified towns and villages, creating interlocking fields of fire for PIATs and anti-tank guns. These tactics proved devastatingly effective throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. For the Germans, Villers Bocage revealed dangerous overconfidence. Wittmann's initial rampage seemed to confirm German superiority, one Tiger destroying an entire British column, but the subsequent battle proved that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome determined infantry properly positioned. German commanders recognized they could no longer assume British infantry would retreat from tanks. They needed infantry support, artillery preparation, and careful reconnaissance. Tank charges into towns and villages which had worked in Poland and France in 1940 were suicidal by 1944. The battle also highlighted Germany's resource problems. Losing 6 tanks at Villers Bocage was a catastrophe for German forces. They couldn't replace these losses easily. Every Tiger, every Panzer IV destroyed was one less available for future battles. British losses, while painful, were replaceable. More Cromwell tanks arrived from Britain within days. More PIATs, more ammunition, more everything flowed across the Channel in seemingly endless supply. The Germans fought with what they had. The British fought with the entire industrial capacity of the Commonwealth and United States behind them. Herbert Thompson survived the war. He returned to his pre-war job as a clerk in a Liverpool shipping office. He rarely spoke about Villers Bocage, deflecting questions with typical British understatement. "Did my bit," he'd say. Nothing special. But his neighbors knew. The local paper had covered his military medal award. Children in the neighborhood would ask him to tell stories about fighting tigers. Sometimes, on particularly insistent requests, he would. In a 1987 interview for a BBC documentary on D-Day plus 40, Thompson finally spoke at length about the battle. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, wearing his military medal ribbon on his lapel. "People think it was heroic," he said to the interviewer. "It wasn't. It was terrifying. Every moment I thought I'd die. The only reason I kept fighting was because I was more scared of letting down Dennis and Sergeant Bro than I was of the Germans." He paused, looking directly at the camera. "That's what people don't understand about war. You don't fight for king and country in the moment. You fight for the man next to you. Dennis loaded that PIAT while shells were falling all around us. I couldn't let him down. That's all it was." Dennis Williams returned to Yorkshire after the war. He went back to coal mining, working underground until he retired in 1978. He and Thompson maintained a correspondence for over 50 years, writing letters several times a year. They attended Rifle Brigade reunions together until age made travel difficult. Williams died in 1992. At his funeral, Thompson gave the eulogy. "Dennis saved my life a dozen times that day in Normandy," Thompson said to the gathered mourners. "He loaded that bloody PIAT faster than any man I ever saw. He never panicked, never complained. When I did something stupid, and I did plenty of stupid things, he just shook his head, grinned, and said, 'Right then, Herbert, let's make it work.' That's the kind of man he was." Sergeant Arthur Bro made the Army his career. He rose to the rank of Regimental Sergeant Major, serving in Palestine, Korea, and Cyprus. He retired in 1965 with a chest full of medals. In retirement, he wrote a memoir titled Rifleman 50 Years in Green. The chapter on Villers-Bocage was the longest in the book. "I was surrounded by the bravest men I ever knew that day," Brow wrote. They were clerks and miners and shop assistants who'd been civilians 3 years earlier, but when German tanks came at them, they stood. They didn't have superior weapons or training. They had something better. They were British infantrymen, and they'd be damned if they'd run from Germans. Major Dennis Wright, no relation to the author, remained in the Army until 1954. He commanded various rifle companies during the post-war years, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He never spoke publicly about Villers-Bocage, considering it simply duty done. Michael Whitman's fate was less kind. After surviving Villers-Bocage, he continued his legendary career for 2 more months. On August 8, 1944, near Cinsault in Normandy, his Tiger was engaged by Canadian Sherman tanks. Multiple Shermans fired simultaneously from an ambush position. Whitman's Tiger exploded, killing him and his entire crew instantly. The irony wasn't lost on historians. The greatest tank ace in history, who destroyed over 130 tanks, was ultimately killed using the same tactics that Thompson and Williams employed at Villers-Bocage. Wait in ambush, strike at close range, don't give the Tiger time to use its advantages. The PIAT remained in British service until the 1950s. Even after better anti-tank weapons became available, the old spring-loaded tube stayed in the arsenal. It was used in Palestine during the Malayan emergency and even saw limited action in Korea. Soldiers who'd never faced German tanks still trained with PIATs because the weapon taught fundamental infantry anti-tank skills: patience, courage under fire, precise shot placement. These lessons transcended any specific weapon. Modern military historians debate the PIAT's effectiveness. Some call it the worst anti-tank weapon of World War II, citing its awkwardness and short range. Others note its impressive combat record and argue it was better than its reputation suggested. The truth is probably that the PIAT was exactly what British industry could produce in the desperate years after Dunkirk. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't advanced, but it worked, and in the hands of brave men like Thompson and Williams, it could kill tigers. In the Imperial War Museum in London, a PIAT sits in a display case. The placard notes its technical specifications and service history, but it doesn't mention Thompson and Williams. It doesn't tell the story of Villers-Bocage. That story lives on in regimental histories, in veterans' memoirs, and in the collective memory of the British Army. It's told to young officers in training, a reminder that determination and courage can overcome material disadvantage. It's remembered by veterans who served with PIATs, who know what it took to face a Tiger with that primitive weapon. The lesson of Villers-Bocage isn't really about the PIAT. The weapon was just a tool. The lesson is about the men who wielded it, British infantry who refused to break, who stood against impossible odds because retreat was unthinkable. Beyond the individual stories of courage, Villers-Bocage had strategic consequences. The battle delayed German reinforcements moving toward the Normandy beachhead. While British forces withdrew from the town, they'd bought time for other Allied units to consolidate positions. The Germans learned they couldn't simply rush reinforcements forward without proper reconnaissance and preparation. Every Norman village might hide British anti-tank teams. Every street corner might conceal a PIAT. This caution slowed German response times throughout the Normandy campaign. British commanders, meanwhile, learned that their infantry could hold against German armored counterattacks if properly positioned. This knowledge shaped defensive planning for the rest of the war. When German panzers attacked, British infantry increasingly stood firm, rather than withdrawing and waiting for their own tanks to arrive. The psychological impact on German tank crews shouldn't be underestimated. Before Villers-Bocage, Tiger commanders felt nearly invincible. They dominated battlefields in Russia and Italy. Their thick armor seemed impenetrable to Allied weapons. After Villers-Bocage, they knew vulnerability. A hidden British soldier with a PIAT could kill them. This knowledge made them cautious, defensive. Tiger tanks that should have been aggressive offensive weapons were increasingly used defensively, protecting their vulnerable sides and rear. This shift in German tank tactics had cascading effects. Cautious tanks advancing slowly were easier targets for Allied artillery and air power. Tigers that might have broken British lines instead waited for infantry support that often never came. German armored superiority, already eroding due to Allied numerical advantages, was further diminished by psychological factors. On a misty morning in June 1944, a Liverpool clerk and a Yorkshire coal miner proved something fundamental about warfare. Superior technology matters, training matters, resources matter. But when men refuse to quit, when they face impossible odds with primitive weapons and extraordinary courage, they can achieve the impossible. The Germans expected British infantry to run from Tigers. They expected rational fear to overcome duty. They couldn't imagine that men armed with spring-loaded tubes would stand and fight against 54-ton monsters mounting 88mm guns. They were wrong. Thompson and Williams, and dozens of men like them throughout Villers-Bocage, demonstrated what British infantry could do when pushed into corners. They didn't have superior weapons. They didn't have tactical advantages. They had stubbornness, courage, and the determination not to let their mates down. The PIAT that nobody wanted became the weapon that stopped Tigers, not through technological superiority, but through the courage of men who wielded it. That's the lasting lesson of Villers-Bocage. In every war, in every desperate moment, there are men who face impossible odds and refuse to break. At Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, British infantry with PIATs proved that determination and courage matter more than armor plate and cannon bore. The Germans laughed at the PIAT, at the primitive spring-loaded tube that British infantry carried into battle. They stopped laughing when Tigers started burning in Norman streets. They stopped laughing when they realized that British soldiers wouldn't run, wouldn't quit, wouldn't surrender. The Battle of Villers-Bocage was nominally a German victory. They held the town. They claimed the field. But they learned that British infantry armed with PIATs could kill their best tanks. They learned that technological superiority wasn't enough. They learned that underestimating British determination was a fatal mistake. Private Herbert Thompson and Lance Corporal Dennis Williams returned to civilian life after the war. They went back to ordinary jobs, ordinary lives. But for one extraordinary day in Normandy, they stood against German Panzers with a weapon everyone dismissed as useless. They proved that courage and determination could overcome technological advantage. That's the story of Villers-Bocage. That's the legacy of the PIAT. And that's why British soldiers who faced German tanks with spring-loaded tubes deserve to be remembered as heroes. The Germans expected them to run. Instead, they stood. And they won.